The carriage smelled of cedar and her stepfather's guilt. Senna kept her eyes on the window as the city of Arveth fell away behind them, the crooked rooftops, the market quarter where she had bought bread every morning for 19 years, the narrow street where her mother had taught her to read by lamplight, all of it shrinking, all of it gone. Beside her, her stepfather stared at his hands. "It is a position of honor," he said. It was the 4th time he had said it since dawn. Senna did not answer. The kingdom of Arveth had 2 princes. Everyone knew the younger one, Kale, bright and sociable, with their father's jaw and their mother's talent for making every person in a room feel briefly, convincingly beloved. He attended every feast, judged every tournament, smiled from horseback in every public procession. In 3 months, he would marry Lyris, Senna's stepsister, and become the most eligible young man in the kingdom's history to also be already married. The elder prince was a different matter. Rodan was 24 when the sickness took him, not a sickness of the body exactly, but of the mind. It had come on gradually, the way a tide comes in, first the sleeplessness, then the rages, then the long silences that stretched for days. The Paulicians' physicians had no name for it. The priests called it a curse. The people called it madness, in the same hushed, slightly thrilled tone they used for all royal misfortune. He was kept in the East Wing. He was alive. He was, technically, still heir to the throne, which was the problem, or rather the problem that had produced Senna's current problem. If Rodan died without an heir, Kale would inherit. If Rodan produced an heir, that child would inherit, with a regency council to govern until they came of age. The king, old and afraid of his elder son, and unwilling to formally disinherit him, he'd threaded an impossible needle. He would find the prince a companion, someone to manage him, someone to be present in the East Wing and keep the prince from burning it down, and if children resulted, so much for the succession. It was, the court chamberlain had explained to Senna's stepfather, a position of honor. Her stepfather had agreed before she was even in the room. The palace of Arveth was larger than Senna had imagined and colder than seemed architecturally necessary. She was received not by the king, who was unwell himself, she was told, but by a woman named Hessa, the palace steward, who was somewhere between 50 and immortal and had the focused, slightly predatory manner of someone who had outlasted 3 monarchs and expected to outlast several more. Hessa walked her through the public wing first, as though Senna were a prospective buyer being shown a property. Grand hall, chapel, kitchens, library. Senna slowed here, taking in the shelves that climbed to the vaulted ceiling, the long tables, the smell of old paper and candle wax. "You read?" Hessa asked, noticing. "Yes." A pause. Assessment. "Good. He reads. It is sometimes useful." They climbed 2 staircases and passed through a door that required a key from Hessa's belt. The East Wing was quieter than the rest of the palace. The carpet was thicker. The windows were narrower. "He has periods of clarity," Hessa said, her voice dropping slightly in register without dropping in volume, a trick, Senna thought, of long practice. "During those times he is manageable, intelligent even. During the other times you will come and find me. You will not attempt to intervene alone. Do you understand?" "What does the other times mean precisely?" Hessa looked at her with something that might have been respect or might have been pity. "You'll know," she said. They stopped before a boar at the end of the corridor, heavy oak, iron-banded, unremarkable except for the silence behind it, a very specific quality of silence, Senna thought, like a held breath. Hessa knocked twice, waited, knocked once more. "He knows you're coming. Whether he'll receive you is another question." A long moment, then a voice, low, unhurried, with the faint rough edge of someone who had not spoken much recently. "Come in, then." She had expected wildness, chains perhaps, or the disheveled mania of every story she had ever read. She had steeled herself for something frightening. Rodan was sitting at a desk by the window, reading. He was older than Cale by 5 years, which put him near 30, tall, dark-haired, going slightly gray at the temples, with the angular features of the royal line, and the look of someone who had been, at some point, very handsome, and had lost interest in maintaining it. He wore plain clothes, no insignia, no jewelry. His hands, folded on the open book, were steady. He looked up. His eyes were gray and extremely alert. "You're the girl they've sent," he said. "I'm not a girl, I'm 19. A pause. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite surprise. "Sit down then, 19. She sat in the chair across the desk from him, because it was the only other chair in the room, and she would not stand before him like a supplicant. Hessa, she noticed, had not come in. "They explained what this arrangement is," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "And you agreed?" "I was not consulted." He absorbed this, looked back at his book, then back at her. "What is your name?" "Senna." "Senna," he said at once, as though filing it away. "Do you know what my difficulty is, Senna? The physician's best theory?" "No." "They think the world becomes too loud, not literally, not sound, but sensation, meaning. Everything arrives at the same volume, and I cannot sort it." He turned a page without reading it. "On bad days, I cannot tell what matters from what doesn't. A candle and a catastrophe feel identical." She was quiet, processing this. "On good days," he continued, "I am merely strange." "What kind of day is today?" He considered. "Moderate, trending good." He glanced at the window where the afternoon light was going gold over the palace rooftops. "You can ask what you want to know." "Can I have access to the library?" He blinked. Whatever question he had expected, it was not that. "The library?" "Downstairs. I saw it when I came in. Hessa didn't say it was restricted." "It isn't." A longer pause. "You may use the library." "Thank you." "Rodan." She stopped halfway to standing. "I should tell you," he said, still looking at his book, "that I am aware of what my father intends by this arrangement, and I should tell you that I have no interest in—" He paused, choosing words with evident care. "Adding to your difficulties. Whatever my father hopes, it is not a thing I would impose." He turned another unread page. "I thought you should know that." Senna stood still. It was, she thought, the first honest thing anyone had said to her in 3 days. "Thank you," she said, and this time she meant it differently. She settled into the east wing like water finding its level. The room with the blue door was small but warm, with a window that looked over the kitchen gardens, and a narrow bed and a writing desk that someone had clearly used often and recently, from the ink stains on the wood. She arranged her few possessions, and sat in the last light, and allowed herself finally to grieve, not loudly, not long, but the way her mother had taught her to approach necessary pain, directly and without flinching, so it would not ambush her later. Then she washed her face and went to find the library. Weeks passed in a pattern she had not anticipated, strange but bearable, sometimes easier than bearable. Rodan, on his good days, was the most interesting person she had ever spoken to. He had read everything: history, philosophy, agricultural mathematics, a treatise on the migratory habits of desert birds that he could recite from memory and found inexplicably funny in certain passages. He spoke to her not as a ward or a servant or a woman placed in his care, but as a person, which was rarer than it should have been. On his difficult days, she stayed in the library and read, or walked in the kitchen gardens, or sat with Hesse in the steward's office, learning without exactly being taught how the palace actually ran, which was almost entirely through Hesse and had been for years. "You are cleverer than the last 3 they sent," Hesse told her one afternoon, in the same tone she might use to note that the weather was fair. "What happened to the last 3? "Left. 1 within a week. The other 2 lasted longer." A pause. He frightened him. On a bad day he can be alarming. Senna thought about the grey eyes, the careful words, the book always open on the desk. "He frightens himself," she said, "on those days." Hesse looked at her. "Yes," she said, "he does." The bad day came on a Tuesday, without warning, the way they always did. She heard him before she saw him, not screaming, not violent, but pacing, and the pacing was wrong, the rhythm of it, too fast and too loud, and with a quality of desperation that she recognized from her own worst nights, scaled beyond anything she had experienced. She did not go to find Hesse. She knocked on his door, twice, once. The pacing stopped. "Go away," he said. His voice was different, rough, fraying at the edges. "No," she said. A long silence. "Senna," her name in that worn-down voice, barely a word at all. "I'm here," she said, through the door. "I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to open the door. I'm here." She sat down on the floor of the corridor, her back against the wall beside his door, and she started talking, quietly, without particular direction, about the book she'd been reading, about a letter she'd had from her mother's old friend in the city, about the kitchen garden and the argument between the head cook and the undergardener about where to plant the autumn herbs. Small things, real things, an inventory of the ordinary world offered like a rope thrown into dark water. The pacing did not resume. After an hour, she heard him sit down on the other side of the door, the soft sound of his back meeting the wood, his weight settling. They sat there, on either side of the door, in silence that was no longer quite the same silence as before. "Better?" she asked, eventually. A long pause. "Somewhat," he said. The wedding of Prince Cale and Lyris of the merchant family took place in early autumn, all gold cloth and imported flowers, and Senna watched from the gallery above the great hall with Hesse at her side, and felt the distance between herself and her old life become something permanent, like a scar finishing its formation. Lyris looked beautiful. She had always been beautiful. She looked at Cale the way she had always looked at things she'd decided were hers. Cale looked radiant and slightly overwhelmed, the way people do when they've gotten everything they wanted and discovered it has weight. "Your stepsister," Hesse said. "Yes." "She knows you're here?" "She knew before I did. She helped arrange it." Hesse was quiet for a moment. "And yet you don't seem bitter." Senna considered this. Below, the ceremony was reaching its vows. The king sat in his chair on the dais, old and diminished, watching his younger son become the future of the kingdom. "I was," she said, "for a while." She watched Lyris accept the crown of a princess with the practiced grace of someone who'd rehearsed it privately for years. "But I have the library, and interesting conversation, and a room with a fireplace." She paused. "And I am learning from a woman who has outlasted 3 monarchs how a palace actually functions." She glanced at Hesse, "which seems, on balance, more useful than a wedding." Hesse did not smile. She was not a smiling woman, but something shifted in her expression that served the same purpose. "Come," she said, "I'll show you where the steward's records are kept, since the king is occupied." They slipped out of the gallery before the feast began. Winter came early that year. The east wing was cold in the mornings, but Rodan had arranged for more firewood than the household accounts strictly allotted, and Senna had learned that on his moderate days, which came more frequently now, she thought, though she did not say so, he preferred to work at the desk nearest the window, and she preferred the chair nearest the fire, and they had arrived, without discussing it, that the room could hold both of them and their respective silences, and it was better for both of them that it did. One evening in the deep of winter, with snow on the kitchen garden and a fire that had burned down to red coals, he looked up from his book and said, "You should know that the king's physician spoke to me last week." Senna looked up. "About what?" "The succession. My father is not improving." He set the book down. "They are considering a formal regency. Cale would govern in practice. I would remain heir in name only." She watched his face. "How do you feel about that?" A silence. Outside, snow ticked against the glass. "Relieved," he said, and the word came out with the force of something long held in. "I would make a terrible king. I know that. I've always known that." He looked at his hands. "A king cannot afford the volume, the everything at once." He paused. "Cale will be fine. He is shallow, but kingdoms can survive shallow kings. They cannot survive absent ones." Senna thought about this. "You're not absent." "I am mostly absent." "No," she said it more firmly than she intended. "You are selective. You are here for the things worth being here for." She stopped, slightly surprised at herself. Rodan looked at her. The firelight made the grey of his eyes warmer than usual. "That is a very generous interpretation," he said. "I am a very pragmatic person. I don't bother with interpretations that aren't accurate." The silence that followed was the kind that meant something had shifted, almost imperceptibly, in the geography of a relationship. A small door opened onto a larger room. "Senna," he said. "Yes, I think—" He stopped, tried again. "I am glad you sat outside my door." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "So am I." The fire settled, and the snow fell, and outside the east wing, the palace went about its enormous life, full of ambition and ceremony, and the grinding of historical forces too large to see from the inside. But in the room with the writing desk and the chair by the fire, something small and exact and true was beginning, on its own quiet terms, to grow. The recipe was written on a folded piece of paper so old it had gone soft at the creases, like cloth. Senna had carried it since she was 12, tucked inside the cover of whatever book she was reading, transferred from coat to coat, present through every move, loss and rearrangement of her life. Her father had pressed it in her hand 2 days before he died, when the fever had already taken his voice, and he could only hold her wrist and look at her with the focused urgency of a man trying to say something too large for the time remaining. He understood. Keep this. What she had not understood for 7 years was why. The recipe was written in her father's handwriting, a physician's hand, precise and small, and it described a preparation of 7 herbs, some common, some not, in proportions she had memorized without meaning to, through sheer repetition of reading. She had looked it up once in her mother's household book. The herbs were used individually for sleep, for inflammation, for the calming of agitated nerves. Together, in these quantities, the combination appeared in no reference she had ever found. Her father had been a physician before he was a merchant, before the debts, before her mother's second marriage, before everything. She had never known what the recipe was for. She thought she might know now. It began, as most important things do, quietly. She had noticed in the deep months of winter that Rodan's difficult days correlated with certain conditions: poor sleep, which she knew because she could hear him pacing at hours when the palace was otherwise silent, missed meals, which Hesse tracked and worried over, and something harder to name, a kind of accumulated weight, as though the world's volume increased gradually until it overwhelmed him, and the only release was the crisis itself. She had begun to wonder, in the library, among the medical texts she had started to favor over history, whether the crisis could be interrupted, whether the weight could be relieved before it reached its breaking point. She thought about the recipe. She thought about it for 3 weeks before she said anything. "I want to try something," she told Rodan on a morning in late winter, when he was in a good period, and both of them were at the desk, him with his administrative correspondence, which he still handled on clear days with a precision that impressed her, her with a medical text she borrowed from the palace physician's shelf. He looked up. "That sentence has a great many possible continuations. It involves herbs and your cooperation." A pause. "Continue." She laid the recipe on the desk between them. He read it once, then again. His expression did not change, but she had learned to read the stillness of his face the way she read weather, what the small variations meant, where the pressure was sitting. This was careful attention. This was interest that didn't want to be hope yet. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "My father. He was a physician before other things." She smoothed the paper necessarily. "I don't know if it will work. I don't know what it's for with certainty. I only know that when I look at what happens to you, and I look at what these herbs do individually, the logic seems sound," he said quietly. He was still looking at the paper. "The ingredients, can you source them?" "Hesse can get me anything in the city within 3 days. I already asked her." He looked up at that.